Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to TCAP webinar. My name is Azra Syed. I'm a TCAP training coordinator. Today's training is on traffic engineering, design, construction, and inspection process for external staff. I would like to give you some house rules because I'm recording the presentation for future use to avoid interruptions and background noise during the training. Keep your microphone muted and cameras off during the training. If you have questions, please type them in the chat box and we will answer all the questions, and we will have a Q&A at the end of the training. Now I'll turn it over to Ryan to get started.
Thank you very much, Azra. Good afternoon, everyone. Like Azra mentioned, my name is Ryan Morales, and just work here at the TCAP Central Office uh, as process specialist with all of our facilities here at the Port Authority. Just to give you a brief introduction, before anything else, we'd like to hear from you, as usual. We'd like to hear from you, and your feedback is anonymous, but we do share it with our presenters just to let them know how they did. If there's anything special you would like for us to talk about in the future, we can also program that, and we can make any arrangements as needed to touch those topics that you would like to hear too. And I'm going to put the link actually in the chat box in a few. You're going to see that coming up. Today, we have traffic engineering webinar, design, construction, and inspection process. So from our engineering and architectural team, traffic engineering, we have Allison Kronert. We also have on the REO side, or the resident engineer's office, Carmela Sinocolo and Daniel Pineda. And on the inspection part from Quality Assurance Division, Jamal Abu-Ghalis. And without further ado, I believe we can give them their slides. And Allison, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Allison Kronert. I'm the traffic engineer in the Planning and Project Delivery Group at the Port Authority, which falls under traffic engineering. And my roles and responsibilities really span across all the Port Authority's different facilities. So this includes aviation, tunnels, bridges, terminals, ports, everything that the Port Authority has to offer. And these responsibilities include providing traffic engineering services, which also includes coordinating with TCAP and reviewing the TAAs that you may be submitting. Next slide. So I don't do all the reviews by myself. We have a whole team of traffic engineers who are working on these reviews, and we're all part of the Engineering and Architecture Design Division. Now, QAD, our Quality Assurance Division, is actually who ends up coordinating the review. They'll send it over to Ryan Lobb, the principal of the Traffic Engineering, Planning, and Project Delivery Group, and then we make sure that it gets reviewed on time with valuable feedback. Next slide. So you may be wondering, when does traffic engineering have to be involved in these reviews? Now, this list here isn't exhaustive, but it does give a good idea of when to call someone in from traffic for concurrence. So this is any time that a project might add volumes to our roadways or facilities, and this would then result in a scoping meeting required for traffic studies. Anything that adds or modifies an access point, if you're adding a building that requires a new driveway, that's definitely something that we have to review because we have certain standards that we need to make sure we're adhering to. Anything that impacts our roadways, so this could be traffic signals, permanent traffic barriers, any additional signing or pavement marking on our roadways. Anytime that you have a project that might impact pedestrian movements, this isn't always thought of when you think of traffic engineering. You mainly think of vehicles probably, but we also get involved in the pedestrian detours as well. And any projects that impact facility operations. So this is a very general bullet point here, but it does encompass a lot as far as facility operations go, which we'll get into a little bit later on as well. And then lastly, projects that require maintenance of traffic on our roadways or pedestrian routes. Maintenance of traffic is probably the most common thing that we see in TAAs, especially during construction. So I did also want to add in, while it's not super common in our reviews, it definitely does come up, and that's airside work. And a lot of times this may fall under the discipline that is civil, but there is specific criteria of when it does fall under traffic. And the main case where we would get involved is when the restricted vehicle service road is impacted. Next slide. So now that you know when to call in traffic, what actually needs to be reviewed? So we have our traffic impact studies, as we mentioned. This would include any design exceptions from Port Authority standards. Our design exceptions are if you are deviating from our standards. We usually have different guidelines if you go through any of our standards of what's required as a minimum, what's desired. If we can't meet the desired, then that would require a design exception. So that is where you would work with traffic engineering. We could set up a meeting. We would write up a memo together, and then I would review that with my chief and make sure that we have his concurrence on it, and then we file it away. This is just a good way to have record keeping of why we weren't able to meet a certain standard. Then we have traffic drawings. So again, these are the traffic signals, the permanent traffic barriers, signs, and pavement markings. Again, we have standards for all of these. We want to make sure that any of the drawings that we're reviewing are following our guidelines here, especially if they're on Port Authority property. And then lastly, we have our maintenance of traffic drawings. These we want to make sure are following Chapter 6 of the MUTCD. And it's important that we get this during the design phase. When we're going through the drawings, sometimes maintenance of traffic is omitted and it's assumed that it's going to come later on when the contractor is actually planning out the work. But that adds time to it because we do have our reviews that we need to go through the process, make sure that the maintenance of traffic that's being provided is not only safe, but that it works with our facilities operations. And we need to make sure that all of that is perfectly aligned. Next slide. So these are some of our codes and design standards going back to what I was just talking about as far as our roadway access management guidelines. This is where if you were adding a new driveway, this would be a great reference document. And in there we have our minimum driveway requirements, spacing, as well as our desired. And again, desired is the standard to meet. But if you can't meet that standard and it can only be the minimum, we have to justify that in a design exception and we'll work through it. Then we have our traffic engineering design guidelines, which we'll get into a little bit later on. But the traffic engineering design guidelines has all of our different standards throughout it. So pavement marking guidelines, signing guidelines, anything that you might need a reference for, you can find in that document in the appendix. Then we have the FHWA manual and uniform traffic control devices. This is the MUTCD. Here, you'll have everything that you need for a lot of different applications. The one that we mainly comment on for TAAs is making sure that our maintenance of traffic drawings are adhering to the federal standards and guidelines. Then we have AASHTO, Policy on Geometric Design of Highways and Streets, which is known as the Green Book. And as we're going through all these reviews and we're referencing our codes and design standards, once we come to a conclusion and a final disposition, we'll let you know that we don't have any further comments. Next slide. So to give you a little bit of an idea of what we look for internally, we have a quality control design checklist that we look at anytime that we audit drawings in-house from a consultant. And while this isn't the same exact application, we do look at a lot of similar things here. So there's a couple things on this checklist that I just wanted to point out and really highlight here. The first thing here is verify compliance with Port Authority standards and design guidelines. So there's a lot of confusion a lot of times with TAAs, I think, when do you need to follow Port Authority standards versus not following Port Authority standards. So an example that I like to use is a parking lot. If you have a parking lot and you want to stripe out this parking lot with purple pavement markings, but our standard says that you have to use white, you are able to use those purple pavement markings if it's your parking lot. But that being said, you still have to meet the ADA requirements and make sure that the building has the proper ADA accessibility. So while there is a little bit of a gray area sometimes, where you need to meet like federal codes versus Port Authority codes, we'll be able to kind of help guide that as well. The next thing here, verify that the confirmation design is in compliance with all code standards identified on the drawings, including federal, state, local, and others. So this is exactly what I was just mentioning before, that if you have a parking lot, you still need to meet those ADA requirements. That's not something that we can just bypass, even though it's a private parking lot. So we want to make sure that everything there is in compliance. Then just make sure that your design calculations are provided and signed. That's if and when they're required. Next. So the one that Ryan is pointing to here, verify that a construction staging and phasing plan has been provided on the drawings and has been coordinated with the hours of work and construction duration as required. So this really ties into our maintenance of traffic plans. We want to make sure that the MOT that we receive is in compliance with the MUTCD, but also that it works for the actual project that you're looking to implement. So we want to make sure that the construction staging and phasing matches what we have in the MOT, that everything is covered. And on top of that, that it's been coordinated with the facility for hours of work, construction durations are a big thing, and also coordination with other projects at the facility. We can go to the next slide. So here we have a lot of maintenance of traffic specifications here. So verify that the MOT drawings have been included and coordinated with construction, staging, and phasing, which we just mentioned. Verify that the contract documents specify the extent of flagger operations. So if you have a road that's being closed off in one direction and we're using flaggers for both directions, we need to specify the extent of the flagger operations on the drawings. Also, I wouldn't include flaggers on your drawings if you don't actually need flaggers. And I would take out any notes of flagger operations if there are none involved, because there is some confusion sometimes with the contractors. That being said, flaggers are a specific job construction. The CMD portion, we'll get into it in a little bit, but the flagger operations, it's not just anyone can be a flagger. So it's important to note that as well. Verify that the documents specify the extent of daily and end of contract removal of these devices. You can't just leave out maintenance of traffic throughout the night. Everything should be picked up at the end of the day to ensure that our facility operations are running. So this ties into our hours of work. We want to make sure that any of our existing traffic control devices, so this is signs and markings, that they've been checked for any deficiencies or missing items. So just want to make sure everything is the way that it was placed out there. If there's any damage to Port Authority guide rail, that it's replaced in kind, and if there's a note specifying that it will be replaced at no cost to the Port Authority. Verify that all traffic signals in the work area have been checked for deficiencies or missing items. So this is more specific to traffic signals here, which we'll get into in a little bit. Verify the requirements for commissioning, integration, and testing of all new relocated or modified ITS equipment has been included in the contract documents. So this is important for any of our ITS devices. We want to make sure that that's taken into account as well. Verify that all new and existing installations have been analyzed for the need to incorporate the appropriate roadside barriers in the design. So we want to make sure that if there's a light pole being placed within the clear zone on the side of the road, that it's properly protected, and anything that needs to be protected is adequately protected. So this is kind of where the calculations start coming into play as well. There's a lot of calculations throughout our designs, as far as the different tapers for MUTCD and anything within the clear zone, those all need to be calculated. It's not just stated point blank necessarily in our guidelines. And then lastly, verify that maintenance of traffic drawings have been coordinated with all work required by other disciplines throughout the stages of construction, especially looking at civil, structural, geotechnical, and electrical. So we want to make sure that if we have maintenance of traffic that's on a specific roadway, that we're covering the work areas. If there is going to be trenching or anything like that on the side of the roadway, we want to make sure that that work area is protected. Anything with conduit work, whatever it may be, we want to make sure that just everything is covered. You can go to the next slide. Actually, sorry, there was one other thing that I did want to mention on the previous slide. We also just want to make sure that our existing conditions are correct on our drawings. So a lot of time we will receive drawings and the base map might not be up to date. If you need base maps, please reach out to us. We could try to help out as best as possible with that. But this really prevents comments later in the process when we have everything accurate from the start, because if we have these drawings, we review them and they look okay on paper, but then we send it off to construction and it's going through the construction phase. And we have our inspectors out there and they notice that maybe a ramp is closed that wasn't supposed to be closed and people are supposed to detour that way. With so much redevelopment going on in our facilities, we want to make sure everything is as up to date as possible. This way it prevents comments later on in the process, because then when that's recognized in the field, it's going to be a whole rush to get these new contract drawings. We don't want to delay anything. So that was all I have to say about that. Next slide. Thanks. So these are our traffic design guidelines. This is a super helpful document here. So it gives the overview of our traffic discipline, just the breakdown of our different groups and the different roles and functions of each group within traffic engineering. And then it goes through our technical and code standards and our regulations. Then it gets into our design criteria, also has all of our standard notes, details, and specifications. As I mentioned, this has all of our standard notes, details, and specifications, but this is just typed out. If you need any CAD files, we're always available and willing to share those as well. So if you need any specific details for pavement markings, for signing, whatever it may be, we can provide that to you. Same with our specifications. If you need to know exactly what thermoplastic we're using, we're able to provide that. You can find the code numbers in the document here, but if you need the actual documents, the PDFs, the CAD files, anything, we're available and we can send those out to you. And then in the appendix of this document that you can find online under the engineering documents, you'll find our roadway access management guidelines that I had mentioned earlier, airport roadway design manual, low clearance signing guidelines, pavement marking design guidelines, roadside and median barrier design guide, our ITS design guidelines, our signal design guidelines, and also our Division 1 maintenance of traffic specification, which anytime you are on or adjacent to our roadways, it's important that we include. You can go to the next slide. So now that we talked a lot about our review process, what has to be reviewed, let's talk about some sample reviews. So let's pretend that we have some utility work at JFK. What are some of the comments that you're going to be seeing on these drawings? So if you don't have any drawings provided, we'll make sure that we receive them. So provide and review maintenance of traffic drawings according to the Chapter 6 of the MUTCD. We want to make sure that we receive that. And then also ensure that all the proper permits are obtained by all stakeholders needed. So New York City DOT, New York State DOT, Port Authority, depending on the roadway that you're in. A lot of our facilities overlap with a lot of other different stakeholders. So we want to make sure that they're all notified and aware and that proper permits are obtained. Can you go to the next slide? So here is another example. So if we have a new park at the George Washington Bridge here, so you can see it on the screen. There's the George Washington Bridge Park. This was something that we had actually done in-house. But if a new drainage pipe has to be installed and we have to do maintenance of traffic in the roadway that's cutting into the sidewalk, we want to make sure that we're still maintaining access for pedestrians, having that proper MUTCD maintenance of traffic on Cabrini Boulevard, whatever it may be. And as we were mentioning before, want to make sure that any other construction that may be occurring simultaneously is well coordinated with the engineer. So also on this drawing, you could see the blue call out for the North Walk. This was going on simultaneously with the Bridge Park. So we want to make sure that that's all coordinated. And then, of course, because this is near New York City DOT roadways, if we have to do any sort of coordination with them for closures on their roadways, their sidewalks, whatever it may be, we want to make sure that that's covered. Here, if we have a new driveway installation, we want to make sure that any additional driveway access follows our access management guidelines. As I mentioned, there's the minimum, there's the desired. We try as hard as we can to meet that desired, whatever the configuration might need to be. So we want to make sure that that's followed. Depending on your traffic impact analysis of how many vehicles will be using this driveway, we might need to look into whether or not it requires a traffic signal. If it does end up requiring a new traffic signal, if it crosses that path, then we need to make sure that we're following the traffic signal design guidelines and the pavement marking guidelines as well. So, and in most cases, the traffic signal will be turned over to the Port Authority at the end. So we'll have to go through the whole inspection process as well, which we'll get to in a little bit. Next slide. So this is something that we've been seeing come up a little bit more recently as well. These are EV charger installations. So typically they're within a parking lot that already exists. And if that's the case, we need to make sure that maintenance of traffic drawings are provided in accordance with Chapter 6 of the MUTCD. We need to make sure that ADA requirements are also met. Even if it's your own lot, ADA requirements do have to be met. If you're only installing a handful of chargers, depending on the location, I know that there have been examples in the past where only one charger may be being installed or 2 or 3 chargers are being installed. In that case, I know that signs have been implemented in the past where it will say something along the lines of accessible EV charging space, use last. Something along those lines. This just ensures that we're meeting that ADA compliance, also making sure that you have the hatched out space on the side that's required. All that can be found in our guidelines as well. But that being said, if it's being turned over to the Port Authority, make sure that our signing and striping matches our standards here. So the Port Authority has specific EV charging standards. Next. This last example here is if we have an advertising installation, we want to make sure that we're receiving maintenance of traffic drawings in accordance with Chapter 6 of the MUTCD. A lot of times people will say, oh, but it's on the side of the building. We don't need to account for that. You still do, especially if it's going to be over a sidewalk even if it's just pedestrian maintenance of traffic, we need to make sure that that's maintained, that the pedestrians are properly detoured. I know traveling is confusing for a lot of people and just navigating the airports can be difficult. What might seem obvious for some people going around and navigating around a site, it's not always that straightforward. So we want to make sure that all of our customers are also having a good experience.
Thank you very much, Allison. And with this, we want to open for the resident engineer's office. There is a question, Allison, for you, but we're going to read that at the end. So stay with us.
Sounds good.
Arios,
Thank you, Ryan. For those of you who have participated in past webinars, you'll see our presentation may look a little familiar to you. Just for the record, we've standardized our presentation to include roles and responsibilities by the various stakeholders, specifically the engineer of record, the general contractor, as well as the resident engineer's office, and how we coordinate the work throughout the process. This all could be found in the tenant construction view manual. It's outlined, it's clear. We update these slides to incorporate the new discipline, a new element of work. As you know, the resident engineer's office is located at various Port Authority facilities. We are the boots on the ground. We do go out and field audit in accordance to the approved drawings. And as Allison clearly outlined the requirements for the design stage as well as during construction, I have with me Dan from my office as well as Michael, who will touch base on the REO roles, construction process, and typical deficiencies found. Just for the record, we are here to assist you throughout the process and get you to that final permit to go live or occupy the space. So I'm now passing this on to Dan to start off the presentation.
Thanks, Carmela. Good afternoon, everybody. Beginning with the resident engineer's office roles and responsibilities. Primarily, the REO remains as the primary point of contact between the tenant team and the Port Authority all the way from pre-construction to closeout. So we coordinate between the tenant team and any PA groups, units, or the facility for all construction activities as required. And we serve as we serve to guide the tenant team. If any questions come up, we want to lead them to a successful project closeout. We do that through our responsibilities, which includes auditing and monitoring the contractor and the AEOR for conformance with the PA-approved contract documents and ensuring that all TCAP procedures are followed. We coordinate with the various PA units to attend and witness any required tests that are to be performed by the contractor. And we also coordinate official PA inspections through receipt of AEOR certification packages, reviewing them for completeness, and we'll review the special inspection reports and test reports, and we will coordinate those PA inspections once all work areas are complete. And we do that through field verification. The REO will issue inspection minutes noting any inspection comments, and we track those comments to ensure that all comments are resolved prior to scheduling a reinspection. We process all required documentation to request the permit, and the tenant coordinator will issue the temporary or final certificate of authorization and distribute it to the tenant. Next slide, please. Starting with the design phase of the project, it's very critical that at the start of the design phase, the tenant and the AUR conduct their site visit prior to submitting any contract documents. And the purpose is to identify any existing conditions within or surrounding the site. This could be identifying any obstructions or anything that could lead to a field or scope change later on, which could have an effect on the overall project schedule. So we want to minimize any changes that can occur in the field, and this is all through the AEOR and tenant site visit. The REO actually reviews the contract documents for constructability and to get an understanding of the scope of work. So in terms of traffic, we will look at the MOT or maintenance of traffic drawings to understand any operational impacts. If there's any proposed phasing of traffic, we'll want to get an understanding of that via phasing plan. We want to identify what is temporary versus permanent, and we ensure that details are provided for any proposed, whether that's for an MOT, that can be cones, drums, barrels, any channelizing devices. We want to know the size, the spacing of these devices. These are all items that we look for in the drawings. In terms of traffic equipment, we look for quantity and sizing for the equipment, foundation type, if there's any signs to be mounted onto any poles. Pedestrian access is very critical, ensuring that ADA compliance is met, making sure that if there's any temporary pedestrian walkways during construction, that there's protection that is provided for those pedestrians, including providing the proper wayfinding and signage, providing the appropriate lighting levels, And we look to see that the drawings are coordinated between disciplines. So, for example, if you're looking at an ADA compliant sidewalk, to make sure that there's no proposed light poles or traffic poles in the way of the ADA path. And of course, we look to see that all required special inspections are listed on the drawings. The REO will monitor all design comments until they're resolved. So we want to make sure that whatever the resolution is in the design, that is actually built in the field as per that resolution. And we recommend that if there's any phased occupancy, the design professional identifies that early on in the design phase so that we can all track to and plan for that phased occupancy. The goal during the design phase is to receive a no further comment design determination prior to the pre-construction meeting. Next slide, please. I'm just going to go into the pre-construction phase. So a pre-construction meeting can be scheduled once all pre-con documents are approved and the design reaches at a minimum conditional approval. Of course, full approval is the goal. And the REO can begin collecting and reviewing pre-con documents as soon as a contractor is identified. During the pre-construction meeting, we will discuss for design, we'll go over any open design comments and a path to NFC. If there's a change of EOR and what that process would be. We'll review the work scope and the contractor's schedule. We want to see that the schedule is detailed and it'll include any anticipated or required inspections, testing, milestones, opening dates, any phased openings. These are all critical elements that we look to see are included in the schedule, and the more detailed, the better. Any operational requirements or maintenance of traffic, if there's any traffic shifts or phased opening of any roadways, we will also review the site safety, any applicable permits for the scope of work. If the scope of work is outside of Port Authority property, we'll review the limits of work to identify the authority having jurisdiction, and if necessary, we'll come up with a delineation plan to identify who the AHJ would be for that scope of work. We'll review the roadway phasing plans, the contractor's QA/QC plan, and of course the inspection process to successfully achieve closeout. The AUR and contractor responsibilities will include special inspections, testing requirements, and at the pre-con, the AUR is responsible for discussing the scope of work and any critical elements of construction, and this should include the strategy for making sure that all the special inspections are performed as required, and if there's a phased occupancy, these are all topics that the AUR is expected to discuss. And again, we can't emphasize enough that the AUR is 100% responsible for the work and inspections. Port Authority is just here to monitor and audit the work. Special inspections must be performed by people qualified to perform that inspection, and the AUR must submit copies of the signed and sealed special inspection reports as they are performed. And the inspection process meeting is a separate meeting that is recommended for more complex projects where the REO will coordinate with the appropriate parties to go over the expectations and requirements of each inspection.
Thanks, Dan. So I want to go back and emphasize the importance of the general contractor schedule. When it comes to critical activations of a roadway network, as Allison pointed out, there's a checklist. You know, there's a burn-in time. There's site visits, site inspections that should be happening with the engineer of record and the traffic engineer just to make sure that the installation is going as per those approved drawings, that those steps on that checklist working together, again, with the resident engineer's office to coordinate the work is paramount. So when the general contractor's schedule is inclusive of these critical activation, go live, opening of roadway networks, we really need to understand the plan, what the requirements are, and of course, how the Port Authority is going to be coming in to help you and assist you with that, activation. So it's very critical when it's special inspections that, it's also listed on the schedule so that we can participate and be part of that success story. Please, Dan, continue.
Thank you. We can go on to the next slide. Moving on to the construction phase. So during construction, the AUR is expected to ensure that all elements of work are complete prior to scheduling an inspection or requesting an inspection. And the REO role is to monitor and audit all field work, including attending or witnessing any third-party special inspections. And again, this is why it's critical for the contractor to provide that detailed schedule and provide the REO with weekly, 2-week look ahead so that we're aware and able to attend these third-party special inspections. The contractor should provide the REO advance notice of any pre-test or special inspections. All materials used on site are to match the PA-approved contract drawings, and same with the traffic and roadway layout should match the PA-approved contract drawings. The REO will coordinate with the appropriate PA groups, whether that's the PA electrical unit, to coordinate any manhole entries, electrical shutdowns, or tie-ins. And the REO will ensure that all work is complete, installed as per the latest PA-approved drawings, and free of deficiencies prior to scheduling a request for official PA audit inspection. We can go on to the next slide. I'm going to hand it off to Michael, who's going to go over the typical findings of the REO during these PA audit inspections and the typical deficiencies that we find.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael. I'm with the REO here at LaGuardia. So as Dan mentioned, I'm just going to quickly jump through a couple of these bullet points of typical deficiencies that we see in the field when the work is being performed. And also I'll touch on some tips and suggestions on how we can avoid some of these issues. So a very common one, and probably the most common one, is that the contractor did not install the work as per the MOT, as per the approved MOT or approved TA drawing. So for most of the work we're going to do, we're either going to have plans in the MOT plans in the TA themselves, or we'll get subsequent RFIs and phasing plans, which get vetted through the applicable process. So when all these plans get vetted, the expectation is when the work is being installed in a field, it's going to conform to what's been depicted on the plans. Now, several times for various reasons, that's not the case. So we see situations where contractor takes it upon themselves to make field changes without any input from the EOR or Port Authority for whatever reasons, for various reasons that may arise in the field. MOT plans are developed without consideration of real, site-specific field interferences and obstructions. There's fabrication errors for signage, incorrect or deficient traffic control devices being used that do not adhere to the approved plans. Second, just jumping up to some of the next bullet points, flaggers, as Allison had mentioned earlier, flaggers are specifically, on most of the plans we have, they'll be specifically positioned at specific locations. And there are reasons for that, which are obviously vetted out by the EOR for the placement. So the placement has to be adhered to. The contractor or whoever, any other unqualified individual cannot just take it upon themselves to relocate flaggers as they see fit in the field. That decision will be made to a qualified individual, which we would point to the EOR as well. So tying in that third bullet point, traffic engineer not present on site during road shifts, temporary roadway alignments, and new roadway activation. So again, due to the fact that we all know in practice, in real life, a lot of times there are going to be unforeseen interferences and situations that pop up in the field that we might need to adjust the plan. So in those situations, we need a qualified individual, which is either the EOR or a representative from the EOR, to make those calls, not just rely on the contractor taking it upon themselves. So the presence of the EOR in the field during these activations, road shifts, the lack of the EOR in the field, that is a deficiency. So in most of our activations, we require the EOR's presence for that.
And let me emphasize the importance that, as you mentioned, Michael, that the work is always in actual mode. So there's a lot of intricate things that happen on a day-to-day basis. So having the traffic engineer present during these temporary pre-walks to activate roadways is important. Flaggers you may need more flaggers than what's shown on the drawings. Maybe the captured area needs to be larger in magnitude because of the situation at that current location, requiring more cones, more barriers to create that safe passage for pedestrians. So it's not just because you have approved drawings that it works and you're going to make these modifications in the field. It's up to we're really relying on the traffic engineer to be on site to create new drawings. We need them signed and sealed. They get vetted through the TCAP process, which is going through Allison's side through the tenant coordinators, procedures, so that we get it vetted, it gets approved, and then we go ahead and implement it. So I'll let you continue, Michael.
Just moving down the list. So another issue we see a lot, inadequate pavement markings. So both the removal and installation of pavement markings. So we have Port Authority standards. An example with that is oftentimes we may see the contractor electing to black out pavement markings. So instead of actually removing, grinding or scarifying or other means, actually removing the pavement markings, they choose to cover it up with other paints, which it may look good in a temporary, but eventually that wears off and now you have conflict in pavement markings. The use of improper or not approved material itself, so latex versus thermal. Typically, we use thermoplastic. Contractor, for interest of time, money, whatever the case may be, elects to use latex or some of the water-based paint, not conforming to standards. Verification of traffic devices. So several different ITS and traffic devices around our facilities require commissioning and testing to be performed prior to going live. Oftentimes, contractor performs their testing, which they feel is satisfactory to their EOR, but also for specific traffic devices, we also need PA field acceptance testing to also be performed. Just jumping slightly ahead, signage. Those details may not be explicitly called out on a plan, but we still need conformance to the Port Authority standards. Port Authority specifications will specify mounting details for different applications. So even if it's not specified clearly and explicitly on the contract drawings, we have the Port Authority specs, which is a supplementary document to be consulted with. Next slide, please. All right, so just continue with some more deficiencies. Location of traffic poles. So the plans show the traffic poles, posts, whatever it may be, signposts at certain locations. And in the field, the contractor elects to put it in the middle of a ADA right of way. That's an issue. Deficient pedestrian sidewalk and walkway. So we talk about traffic, we're also talking about pedestrian traffic. We have to maintain ADA requirements for all our walkways that we install for any kind of temporary configurations or permanent configurations, which would be going through the TCAP review process, as Carmela and others have said. Incorrect and improper modeling of traffic volume. So as part of some of our requirements during the review process, we may require a model for a new frontage configuration to be submitted by the engineer. If they're not taking into consideration the correct volumes, the correct flow patterns, the correct traffic control devices, signals, everything, that may, present a incorrect depiction of the actual flow of the new volume, which when implemented is going to cause issues. So just to touch on 101, for specific traffic devices such as signals, ITSs, focusing on signals, we have our pre-checklist, pre-activation inspections that have to be formed by PA traffic. Oftentimes, not oftentimes, I won't say oftentimes, but sometimes that may be overlooked, and then we have issues with them with the operation not being in conformance. So again, not a conclusive list of all the deficiencies, but just some typical ones that we run into the field in practice. I'm going to kick it back to Dan now to continue with the rest of the slide.
Next slide, please. Thank you, Michael. So going into field conditions and scope changes, just field conditions, again, we should capture any field conditions during the design phase site visit, but if something comes up during construction, the AUR must notify the REO, and the field inspector will bring it up to the attention of the resident engineer, who will determine the best path to capture the conditions, whether that's through an official scope change submission or captured in an as-built drawing. Typically for fire life safety code related issues, the AEOR must submit an official scope change for PAQAD design standards review or PA traffic review. For minor field conditions, the revisions can be captured on as-built drawings with the resident engineer's concurrence. Next slide, please. Going into AEOR certification requests for partial or final inspections, or phase 3, Port Authority inspections are scheduled by the resident engineer's office through receipt of AUR signed and sealed certification requests. Certification requests must be reviewed and approved by REO prior to scheduling any inspections. No inspections will be conducted on scopes of work with open design comments or any installations deviating from the latest PA-approved drawings. And an AUR representative who is knowledgeable of the scope of work and contractor personnel must be present to conduct the required inspection. And this includes any appropriate subcontractors that are required to operate, test, or demonstrate any systems. And the contractor should be able to provide any equipment, tools, or ladders that are required to access an area for inspection or demonstrate any required testing. At the conclusion of each inspection, REO will issue inspection minutes, noting all inspection comments. And next slide, please.
And I just want to emphasize the importance of bringing the right engineers to the inspection, whether it's your traffic engineer, someone that's knowledgeable and of the work zones. As these inspections take place, of course, our quality assurance division inspector may have some questions, as you'll hear in the next segment of this presentation, and having the right individual, right engineer on site could help reduce those comments if they find them acceptable in response. So it's very important to have all the necessary documents, whether it's shop drawings, special inspection reports, submittals that have been approved, to help depict the situation or area of concern, and hopefully it gets that response gets accepted, so we end up, instead of a page long of comments, we maybe have 1 or 2. That's the goal, bringing the right people, always having the engineer record on site as frequent as possible as the work progresses, so that we could achieve the goals of successful inspections and activations of roadways. Please continue.
Thank you. So we're just going to go over what's required in a certification request package, whether it's a partial or final inspection. So an AUR cover letter is always required. A PH 212 form is required for a partial inspection. A PH 314 is required for a final inspection request. A sketch showing the area being certified. This is typically only for a partial, and sometimes it may not be applicable. So if the AUR can identify the work being certified using the contract drawings, whether that be via the phasing plans, then they can refer to those phasing plan drawings. If a sketch is required, each sketch should be uniquely numbered. It should include the TAA number and title, a date, a legend identifying the area being certified so it's clear what the scope of the inspection is, and an AUR professional seal and signature.
So the sketch is really important that it gets signed and sealed by the engineer of record. It's not 5 pages. It's compiled into hopefully a one sketch that shows the area of inspection. The title block and any general notes that are on that apparent sketch should all be removed if they're not applicable, just so that it removes any kind of confusion that may come along at the inspection, that we're looking at notes and trying to understand how that impacts the inspection. So it's best to just compile as much as you can on 1 or 2 sketches, outline it as Dan mentioned, remove title blocks, remove notes that are not relevant, have it signed and sealed, and submit it with the package.
Thank you. all inspection requests should include a special inspections checklist and applicable special inspection and test reports.
The special inspections checklist, whether it's a partial or a final, it's the engineer of records responsibility to conduct their partial inspection. It's your date. That is the date that we want to see. It should be a cumulative report. So from the beginning, right up to that time of inspection, any new inspections should override the previous one. So it's a cumulative report, signed and sealed as well.
Thank you. And for a final certification request, record drawings are required. And we ask that as-built be reviewed with the resident engineer's office prior to record drawing submission. And the record drawings are required for the final certification request. Next slide, please. We're just going to outline the differences between a partial and a final inspection. So a final inspection is used only when all work on the entire TAA is complete and full design approval is achieved. A partial inspection is used when all work within a specific area is complete. And again, sketches may be used to identify the scope of work being certified. So a partial inspection can be for occupancy or not for occupancy. A partial inspection not for occupancy is used when requesting an inspection for an area prior to losing access. So this could be prior to closing up an excavation where something might need to be inspected. A partial inspection for occupancy is used when beneficial use is requested per the approved design phasing plan. So if you're looking to activate a portion of roadway and require documents at the PA inspection, I know Carmela already mentioned this, but having an AUR on site who's knowledgeable of the scope of work and able to answer any questions and provide documents, whether that's the latest approved contract drawings, any RFI submittals, shop drawings, special inspection and test reports. This is critical to the success of any inspection, ensuring that the AUR representative is able to answer any questions on the spot. And this helps to minimize any inspection comments that are left at the end of any inspection.
And I cannot emphasize this point, how important it is to have an engineer record knowledgeable at each of the inspections, having the area ready and available so that we can get a quick start, see the big picture, and have a successful outcome.
Thank you. And we can go to the next and last slide for the REO. Michael, I'm going to pass it back to you just to go over the key takeaways and tips for success.
Okay, thanks, Dan. So just quickly going over these last bullet points here. So the first one here, we highly recommend full design approval prior to a pre-con meeting to avoid any issues or in scheduling PA inspections, because essentially we're not going to be able to, and probably Jamal might talk more about this, but without full design on any scope of work that we're doing an inspection on, we're not going to be able to issue any permits on. And on the REO level, we really won't even do any inspections on those on that kind of scope.
So again, if there's open rider comments, we will not, the resident engineer's office will not accept a certification package from the engineer of record. All areas must have no comments associated with it.
Right. And moving on to the next one. So we also recommend EOR performs on-site walkthroughs as the design is under review to ensure no glaring work scope is getting missed. Get familiar with the area. So like I mentioned in earlier slides, a lot of the issues we see in the field, the deficiencies we see is because when we get our approved plan and we go out for implementation in the field, we see some elements of the plan just cannot be constructed or installed. So what happens in those cases, essentially the plan has been made up by the EOR under idealized conditions, which in reality in the field, it doesn't match. So that can be eliminated just with the EOR. During the process of developing a plan, you pay certain visits to the field. REO is always on site. We're always available to joint walkthroughs if that's needed. But the key takeaway there is just being cognizant of the actual on-site conditions during the review, during the design of plans. Communication is key to success. Carmela mentioned earlier, the REO's job here is to assist in actualizing the plan, to assist in getting us getting the work performed. So keeping us in the loop of all field issues and scope change is critical throughout the process. In the event where we're implementing new scope that has impacts to society, it's our responsibility to notify local stakeholders in the neighborhood. So maintain community outreach. New roadway alignment should be immediately updated on navigation apps. So everybody uses apps and navigation apps these days, that nobody uses maps anymore. So immediately we're doing a new roadway alignment, a road shift, anything that might impact the existing configuration. We want to update that on all the maps, and same goes with the FHVs, the Ubers, the Lyfts, and other FHVs. Upcoming road shifts should be properly vetted and approved by PA traffic ops. So that's part of the regular review process, right? So we want to make sure the new alignments, new roads, new shifts don't impact existing facility operations. And any impacts that we do discover through our review process, we want to come up with mitigation means to address them. The next bullet point there. EORGC to coordinate with REO in advance of any pre-inspection and pre-testing. So as mentioned earlier, we have various traffic ITS systems, or comm cables, whatever assistance we need from the Port Authority's part, we want to have that communication going on with EOR.
And I'd like to emphasize with the pre-testing, especially for traffic engineering as well as the Port Authority facility electric shop, because they're entering manholes, and almost all these manholes get turned over to the Port Authority as an asset. They are a critical part to that pre-testing, pre-inspection. They want to make sure that, you know, when they issued that permit for that manhole entry, that was in conformance, meaning that, you know, cables were racked, everything was swept, you know, clean, neat. They want to get it back the same way. So the electric shop will be doing inspections throughout the work to make sure they receive these manholes back the same way they were issued. So the coordination effort, by giving the resident engineer enough time to coordinate for the pre-test, bringing in the proper stakeholders, whether it's you're on DOT property, like we mentioned before, if we understand what the roadway network is and who the authority have in jurisdiction in those various zones, we must call them in to make sure that we have one comprehensive inspection. We're all working together to minimize any field issues that would require redo of work is all very important. So I can't emphasize that enough, giving us an advance notice.
Sticking on that same theme, right? The next bullet point, planning ahead. So we have the Port Authority, we have various departments that we need input for certain work elements, right? So we have the facilities group, we have the traffic group, REO, and whatnot. So planning ahead, obviously, it's always a valuable protocol for everything. So giving us enough advance notice for any upcoming testing, anything requiring the assistance of all the departments I mentioned. So we recommend a 2-week look ahead for advance notice for upcoming tenant milestones, pre-testing, and any kind of assistance from the Port Authority. Punch list resolution. So obviously the goal is to achieve all our milestones without any punch list, but we know in reality we're always going to have these lingering punch lists. So addressing a punch list and closing them in a timely manner. We don't want to have punch lists lingering for months and possibly years. So recommend as soon as a activation or new alignment is performed, want to give ourselves a 2 weeks window to abate items. As part of that effort, we want to try to prioritize items. So identify any items that require long lead, and if that is the case and we're not going to be able to meet our window, we want to come up with also mitigation to lessen the impact of not having those punch lists resolved.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Dan. Turning it over to you, Ryan.
Thank you very much. And for our last part in this webinar, successful inspections, we hand it over to Allison for the first part, and then we'll pass it over to Jamal.
Great, thank you. So the first thing that I wanted to go over is traffic's involvement in construction. So any projects that impact Port Authority roadways may require pre-construction transportation management plan and or monitoring by the agency operations center during construction. So a transportation management plan might just be the maintenance of traffic drawings. It might be a little bit more involved in that. It does depend on the context. And then monitoring by the agency operations center. So we have a general agency operations center, and then also a couple of our different facilities have their own sort of agency operations centers as well. So that sort of interagency coordination will make sure it happens, but just to be aware that that's the case. Anytime that we install or modify any permanent traffic devices on our roadways, that will require final inspection. So that's traffic signs, pavement markings, permanent traffic barrier. We just want to make sure that what's in the contract drawings and it has been approved is properly implemented, as everybody was just talking about in the previous slides with construction. We want to make sure that everything that we have on the drawings is what ends up being in the field, because that is what's been approved. There's special consideration given to traffic signal modifications or installations, and we'll get to that on the next slide. And again, our final disposition with design and construction will be no further comments. We can go to the next slide. So here we have our traffic signal inspection checklist. This you can also find on the Port Authority website. It is a pre-final turn-on checklist and then the final traffic signal checklist. So this has to be completed to the satisfaction of the authority before a traffic signal activation can be authorized. So we'll make sure that all the proper people are out in the field, making sure that this inspection is valid. So there's about 100 items that can be checked, and it's under 8 different categories. So we have the prerequisites, pole and mast arms, signal heads, push buttons, cabinet, signal operations, the detection, the pole boxes, the markings and signs that are related to the signals. And it's a very extensive checklist. Again, there's the pre-final checklist, which is when the inspection will begin, and then 30 days later we have the final checklist. So it's a longer process for the traffic signals as opposed to just verifying a sign location, but we want to make sure that the traffic signal is fully operating the way that it should be. Next slide. So next thing here are base maps. In order to make sure that our traffic drawings are accurate, as I was mentioning earlier, we want to make sure that we get updated base maps at the completion of a project. So if you're adding in a new driveway, we want to make sure that we know exactly where this driveway is located and that we have the proper CAD files to make sure that it matches and that we integrate it into our overall base map of a facility. So upon completion of a project, make sure that any CAD files that show any changes to the roadway network, whether it be even a driveway, something small, access point, whatever it is, even if it's restriping of a roadway, we want to make sure that we have those changes, that we have it readily accessible for the next time somebody has a TAA in a similar area, next time Port Authority has a project in the same area, that we have the accurate files. So these changes will be incorporated into future base maps of the facility, and that's part of our final inspection checklist, is that once pavement markings are installed, that we have the proper CAD files and we can integrate it into our base maps. Once the driveway is installed and completed, we can integrate that into our base maps, because it really does impact, while it may seem small that you're just restriping a roadway, adding a left turn bay, it does impact our drawings. So, and the future projects that we have. Next slide. So our keys to success within traffic engineering and the TAA process is really early involvement. So any sort of pre-scoping meetings, there we're able to discuss a lot of the projects, so we can agree on any new driveway locations. We can talk about the need for signalization, any studies that might need to be done, or traffic analyses. any sort of construction staging, we can definitely provide input on that. We're all here to help. We're all working toward the same thing. We can also make sure that we're adhering to Port Authority standards where we might need possible future design exceptions. We can talk about maybe where you might not need to follow certain Port Authority standards. We can have those sort of discussions. And our main role prior to the review is to explain the operational impacts that the project may have on the facility. So when we're able to have these discussions, the intention of the project, why we're doing something the way that we are, why we're viewing something in the way that we are, we're able to explain that impact that it might have on the facility, whether positively or adversely. That's all I had.
And we lost Jamal, but we do have Jamal to take over.
Hi again. So as we mentioned earlier, the engineer of record is 100% responsible for all the work and the inspection. We can't emphasize again that the engineer should be on site as often as needed to ensure that the work is being installed as required. The resident engineer's office only performs audit. We're out in the field verifying that the work is being installed as per the approved drawings. So we're auditing the work that's taking place by the general contractor. The QAD, our Quality Assurance Division, which is Jamal's group, attends inspections that the resident engineer's office schedules efficiently once received by the engineer record certification requesting a partial or final inspection, or if there's coordination work that the REO understands based on the 2-week look-ahead schedule, that there's some sort of live testing or field verification that needs to take place, that will invite our Quality Assurance Division partners along. Similarly, with traffic engineering, if there's any pre-testing that's required, we're going to coordinate with them as well. Next slide, please. The tenant coordinator is part of the TCAP stakeholder team. They're going to work with the tenants and the tenants team on resolution of rider comments from the onset of the design submission right to they get a full design approval, and pre-con meetings, sometimes they're called kickoff meetings. They're there to assist and remind the tenant and their engineer of record to get those rider comments resolved, to ensure compliance, to ensure there's no delay during the construction phase, and those go live or grand openings that the tenant envisions at a specific timeline on the schedule. The resident engineer's office will work with the tenant on resolution of rider comments as well. We help with the tenant coordinator and the team to get those comments to, at minimum, a conditional approval before we would schedule a pre-construction meeting. Inspection requests will not be accepted by our office, the resident engineer's office, and our Quality Assurance Division is emphasizing that again. If there are open design comments related to work that is being called out on a partial or inspection, we will not honor it. We will not put it on the schedule. It will not be official. The resident engineer's office is responsible that once we receive a certification package, go out in the field and verify the work is complete and in compliance. If we see there are open issues or issues that don't match, we will not schedule for any official inspections. The REO will ensure that the complete engineer records sign-off package, which I call a certification package, is submitted, reviewed, and accepted. The resident engineer's office is the gatekeeper in coordinating all stakeholders for whatever, again, it may be, a live test or an official certification package requesting a Port Authority audit. If we see things that are not in conformance, we will not schedule an inspection. Just reiterating it. Next slide, please. What is expected at the inspection? Examination of all traffic elements physical installation of signs, signals, crash barriers, striping. Allison has that checklist. That checklist is a great way to ensure that before we get a certification package, that all these critical items, elements of work are installed and installed correctly and vetted through the process. Examination of bolts, the pattern, the size, the numbers, the washers, the torquing. I had seen, many times when we were doing the redevelopment program here in Terminal B, that signs were installed and sometimes bolts were not torqued properly. And once a resident engineer came across these, we withheld scheduling the inspections. So it's important that the engineer record, the team go out there, do a site inspection, pre-inspection, to ensure that all these critical elements are in conformance. Pedestrian crossing, signals, signs, striping, ADA compliance, make sure that it's all in conformance. And of course, other areas that are required by scope of work will also, we want to emphasize that the engineer record is out in the field, ensuring that the work is in compliance. Next slide, please. Who attends these inspections? We request that the tenant, an engineer record, or an engineer records designee must be in attendance. The resident engineer's office will cancel an inspection if at minimum the engineer record or representative is not in attendance. The general contractor should be on site, prepared to test. So if you're testing controllers to activate traffic signals, we would make sure that you have enough labor forces in the field to carry out that test. They should have all the equipment and tools and ladders and man lifts as needed to provide proper access so that the Port Authority could perform these required tests and audit inspections. Next slide, please. Again, another checklist. We can't have enough checklists, but I'm hoping this drives the message home. A lot of this work is standardized. Having a quick checklist that I'm sure Allison would share would be so instrumental in the success of each and every inspection. So I can't, again, just emphasizing the structural bolting. Many times they're missing bolts, they're not adequate, they're loose, they're missing a washer. Signs, they're missing, they can't be seen, the elevations don't meet the standards. Striping, the pattern is incorrect. It doesn't match the approved drawing, so we can't even have the inspection. Electrical signs, they're not grounded, the disconnect means are not in place. Crash barriers not installed as per approved drawings. All kinds of connections and other requirements that are part of the approved drawings are not in place. Again, these are all going to result to failed inspections or inspections that won't even make it to an official quality assurance and traffic engineering audit. Next slide, please. After the inspection, I believe you heard this from the resident engineer and Dan from our office, that all PA inspection comments will be discussed with the team during the inspection. And again, the REO will gather the inspection team, summarize the comments. At the conclusion, we will prepare the inspection minutes and distribute it to all the parties. Following the inspection, the REO will officially issue these inspection matrix. The inspection matrix will be combined comments of all Port Authority departments. So whether it's REO, QAD, construction standards, health and safety, any food establishment, if we have vertical, horizontal transportation, it'll all be found on that matrix. The tenant's team must respond to these inspection comments and share it with the resident engineer's office as soon as possible. We're hoping that the max it would take is 2 weeks to get these comments addressed, and you can indicate the status if there's something that's immediately ready for inspection, or also add that this is something that's going to take us X amount of time because it's a long lead item. We could go ahead and continue those inspections and abate those few items as the work progresses. We'll include the others when they're ready. The engineer architect of record must verify the completion of correction for all inspection comments. So Once the contractor completes these comments in the field, they're all been addressed. The architect engineer record should be out there doing the same. Once that happens, that matrix gets updated. The resident engineer's office will go out and put a third set of eyes on that. When we feel that the work is in conformance, we will go ahead and schedule an official reinspection of those items. All items must be completed, re-inspected by the Port Authority. Should any request result to a partial occupancy or a final certificate of authorization to use or occupy. Next slide, please. Helpful hints. The engineer record must be present on site during construction to perform all inspections and certify the completeness of work prior to scheduling any inspections. So this, again, we talk about it from the resident engineer side, right through the conclusion to occupancy and inspections. Very critical. The engineer record must review and accept all special inspection reports. The engineer record must submit copies of the sign and seal reports to the resident engineer's office as they are performed under cover letter indicating that the 8-year record accepts all the special inspection reports. The resident engineer's office will attend these special inspections as they take place. Those reports get submitted as soon as possible. REO will take a look at it again, and of course, there may be times that we may need to share these inspection reports with our other stakeholders just to ensure that the work is in compliance. The 8-year record must notify the REO if there's a scope change, and I know Dan had mentioned this prior during our presentation. We will advise what the correct resubmission process would be. Fire code life safety impacts should be submitted officially through the TCAP process. Any minor work, any minor revisions could be reflected as an as-built. Of course, it's with the resident engineer's concurrence. Scope changes should be submitted to the tenant coordinator for review, as mentioned before. Next slide, please. Thank you very much.
And with this, we've come to the conclusion of this presentation. So we're going to ask Azra to stop the recording.